NATO foreign ministers are meeting amid increasing tensions within the defence alliance over the war in Iran and the global fallout. The meeting will discuss the preparation for the Ankara summit this summer, spending strategy and support for Ukraine. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio told the BBC that reports about the reduction of US troops in Europe would also be discussed. He added that President Trump was disappointed with NATO allies over their lack of support. But earlier, Mr. Trump announced that he would send 5,000 troops to Poland. Well, ahead of the meeting, the NATO Secretary-General, Mark Rutte, welcomed President Trump's announcement of those troops being sent to Poland, and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said there has been slight progress on Iran.
Of course, Ukraine will be on the agenda today, making sure that Ukraine stays strong in the fight. And I again want to thank the United States for the fact that the critical flow of US military support to Ukraine in terms of, for example, the interceptors for Patriot systems continues to go, paid for by European and Canadian allies, and it is really vital for Ukraine to stay strong in the fight. Obviously today we have foreign ministers here, so we will discuss foreign issues, and one of the big issues now, of course, is Iran, the Strait of Hormuz, the issue of freedom of navigation, and I hear from many of my colleagues here that it is not acceptable that the freedom of navigation is basically trampled upon as it is at the moment, and we have to think how we collectively can deal with this. And
the president's views, frankly, disappointment at some of our NATO allies and their response to our operations in the Middle East. On the issue of Iran, the news this morning, I know it's early on it's still in the United States, a little later in the region, in the Middle East, but we await word on those conversations that are ongoing. There's been some slight progress. I don't want to exaggerate it, but there's been a little bit of movement, and that's good. The fundamentals remain the same. Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. It just cannot. This regime can never have nuclear weapons. And to achieve that, we're going to have to address the issue of enrichment. We're going to have to address the issue of the highly enriched uranium. And then added to this, of course, is the issue of the Straits. Iran is trying to create a tolling system. They're trying to convince Oman, by the way, to join them in this tolling system in an international waterway. There is not a country in the world that should accept that.
Marco Rubio. Robert Puchel is a senior fellow at the Centre for Eastern Studies in Warsaw and a former NATO official. And he joins us now. Thank you very much for joining us here on BBC News. How welcome will these 5,000 US troops be in Poland that President Trump has announced?
Well, it is good news. There's no question about it. And that's, Poland is quite a polarized politically country, but that is welcomed by an absolute majority in all sides of the political spectrum. Why is it so welcome? Because it reverses an earlier decision, which was frankly highly unhelpful and, not fully comprehensible in the context of the threats that the alliance and Poland, the frontier states, are facing. So this is good news, notwithstanding the way it has been handled, and still lots of questions, because it serves an important purpose from the point of view of deterrence. Russia and Belarus, for example, are conducting nuclear weapons, threatening, trying to send a signal. Russia is openly threatening NATO countries such as Estonia, Latvia, and there is a hybrid war going on. So, the presence of US combat troops on the eastern flank in Poland, who is, yes, it's a country which is really doing a lot to carry the burden, is the right decision, and that's basically how we see it.
How big is the concern, though, within Polish political circles about these tensions within NATO and warnings from the United States that Europe is going to have to be much more self-sufficient?
Well, I think there are two aspects of it, because one dimension is actually not totally negative, because it's, in the end of the day, let's be realistic, it's US pressure, which seems to be usually, that's a tradition in NATO, most successful when it comes to sparing other allies, Europeans and Canada as well, into greater defense spending. And we need that because we have a burden sharing problem in Europe. There are countries on the eastern flank which spend a lot and they're really committed. They're really, really serious about defense effort. And there are other countries, for instance, in the south of Europe, which are still not doing enough. So that's one part which actually helps, paradoxically. But the other part is, of course, not so helpful, because we hear too many things which are either contradictory from Washington or even questioning the actual commitments of US to the alliance. And that is not good. The good news, even in this part of the story, is that that's something which is not actually positively seen in many quarters in Washington. Congress, Senate, and even within the Republican Party. So one kind of hopes for the best, but the truth is this is not the ideal way in which to handle transatlantic relations and the NATO relations in this very testing time. So, one hopes that this decision, nevertheless, proves that one can actually, the pressure works, and secondly, that in the end, if the right things are done, we will not remember what actually came before. What matters is the actual level of security that we all want to enjoy, and US contribution to European security remains of paramount importance.
Robert Puschel from the Centre for Eastern Studies in Warsaw, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.
Let's speak to our correspondent Tom Bateman, who's in Helsingborg at that NATO foreign ministers meeting. Are they scratching their heads there, Tom, about what the United States really is intending and Donald Trump's intentions towards NATO?
I think there is a bit of that actually over the issue of troop deployments, and particularly that announcement that you've been talking about, President Trump appearing to completely contradict what the administration had been saying over the last week or so, with him saying he was going to add 5,000 troops to Poland, which seems to be a reversal of what had come over the last few days, which was the apparent threat to draw down the number of American troops, mostly in Poland, although that was not a removal of forces, it turned out, but the Americans basically suggesting that they wouldn't go ahead with a planned deployment of around, 4,000 troops as it was for Poland. So it seems Mr. Trump is reversing that, although I think here there's just a lack of clarity over exactly what he's saying there. The Polish foreign minister was here just a few moments ago and saying there will be no change to the US force posture in Poland. So I think they, at the moment, feel satisfied that they've got somewhere with that. But more broadly, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State's just been here. I was talking to him last night in Miami, just before we headed to Helsingborg here in Sweden. The Americans are still saying they're really unhappy with their NATO allies over the issue of Iran. And that message was on display again just now from Mr. Rubio, who's saying that he and President Trump remain disappointed, that the sense is disappointment with their NATO partners. And I think what he's trying to do here is get that across to them and try and take something back to Mr. Trump that he can suggest that NATO countries are doing, which Mr. Trump will want to hear ahead of this big summit of NATO leaders in Turkey in July. Mr. Trump still hasn't confirmed whether he'll go to that, and I think he's keeping that hanging over, that uncertainty hanging over that big meeting, which reflects really his lack of commitment, at least rhetorically, to this alliance.
Marco Rubio did say that had been a sign of sort of slight progress, though, regarding the support from NATO for Iran. What does he mean by that? That didn't come across as particularly clear to me.
Well, the slight progress point, as I understood it, was on the issue of the negotiations between the Americans and the Iranians. But he said he didn't want to overplay that, and that's with this Pakistani mediation. He said something similar, actually, as we left the US on Thursday night, that he believes that things are moving in the right direction when it comes to the negotiations, but clearly they're not there yet. On the issue of NATO, I think, as I say, there have continually been these threats from Mr. Trump about troop removals from NATO countries. He called NATO partners cowards, remember, earlier on during the Iran war. And I think hanging over that is always the potential that the Americans are going to punish their allies here. It is what form that might take, which is never quite clear. That uncertainty hangs over this. In a sense, I think in a way, it doesn't matter what the actual practical effects of this are. It is the fact that Mr. Trump keeps demurring from commitment to NATO. That is something certainly, I think, in Moscow, they're always waiting to see how that might turn out in practice. It is, in fact, very hard for Mr. Trump to withdraw the US from NATO without the approval of Congress.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom Bateman in Helsingborg.